Hello, welcome to Read. Today I wanted to talk about Rashōmon and 17 Other Stories by Ryūnosuke Akutagawa. This collection is translated by J. Rubin, translated and compiled and I'll talk about the order in which he laid out the stories a little bit later on. But J. Rubin seems to be a pretty prolific modern translator. I recognized his name because I know that he translated the copy of Norwegian Wood that I have, but he's also done, it seems like, some of Soseki's works, some other of Murakami's works, and so on. And what really surprised me, I'll talk about Akutagawa, I'll talk about his life. I really want to spend time talking about his works because I really, spoiler alert, every single story in this collection is a 10 out of 10 hit for me. I loved this so much. But really quickly, before I get into that, what I was really surprised by was that Akutagawa committed suicide in 1927, and this collection came out in 2006, so nearly 80 years later. And despite Akutagawa seeming to have a very important influence in Japan, I think either Murakami in the introduction to this or somewhere else, someone somewhere else said that Akutagawa is almost like the Japanese father of short stories, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but it was surprising nonetheless that this collection, which came out in 2006, about half of the stories here were translated for the first time, and maybe it's because some of them are less popular, maybe it's because of Akutagawa being a particular stylist that J. Rubin talks about, that there is obviously a risk in losing some stuff or difficulties in translation, but I am immensely appreciative and glad of the work that Rubin did for this collection. So I will really quickly talk about Akutagawa's life story, and then I'll jump into this, and then I'll jump into his works and talk about, again, I'll come back to sort of how they're laid out. But the interesting thing is that the stories near the end of this book are maybe there's some degree of fictionalization, but they're so autobiographical that you can pretty much read them as being just outright autobiographies. Some of the earlier ones, he's changed the name of the main character, but they're at least ideas or essences of the author himself. So some quick life details. Akutagawa was born in 1892, and very importantly, about 8 months after he was born, his mother it's described as just going crazy. She obviously had a mental illness, and so Akutagawa actually gets adopted by the mother's sister and their family. So he kind of goes to live with biologically aunt and uncle, but he actually gets their surname, and he is raised up in their family. And so this is important for two reasons. The first is that he is, in this family, he's exposed to literature, traditional arts. He ends up going and studies English, Chinese, and so on. But very importantly, he still maintained contact with his mother, who died when Akutagawa was about 10 years old. And so the fear of him also going crazy like his mother seemed to have hung on him for basically his life, and you can see it in his stories. He does go on, he studies, he starts publishing works, he gets married, he has kids, and a lot of this stuff, like I said, does come up autobiographically in some of the stories, but the really big things is just that he does always live with this sort of darkness, this mental illness, and this extreme anxiety which manifests as insomnia sort of around the time he's in his 30s. And he is taking sleep medication. Eventually, he uses that medication to kill himself by overdosing on sleep pills, and that happens at the age of 35. A lot of things kind of led to that. Another really big thing which comes up in the stories that I'll get to is that because of certain wars, certain natural disasters, and I think even some other suicides in the family, he slowly becomes financially responsible for more and more people, and that was a really big burden for him, basically. Of course, it was also a burden for his wife and everyone around him, and it's obviously very tragic that there were all of these deaths, but that's sort of part of the reason that, him being a writer and being kind of responsible for this extended family was it seems to be the reason that his mental health pretty rapidly deteriorated in the mid to late 20s. Anyway, the stories were compiled chronologically, but not in the order in which they were written. They were compiled chronologically in the order in which the story is set, which was a really, really weird decision. That I thought that was a weird decision at first, but getting to the end and realizing that it basically allowed Ruben to put all of Akutagawa's stories of himself at the very end. Makes a lot of sense, and so I kind of changed my tune on that, and it's kind of fun to just go back and see exactly when he wrote this. This was an earlier one, and yeah, so we start off in the first collection. The book is in 4 parts. The first one is called A World in Decay, and this is the collection that has the story Rashōmon and also In a Bamboo Grove and some others, and I'll get to those in a second, but I'll also just quickly talk about how much fun it was to discover Akutagawa, because, you know, a lot of the books that are on my bookshelf, I get them because they're part of the Western canon, or they come really highly recommended by other Instagrammers or just influencers or whatever. And so, yes, books can sit on your bookshelf and you haven't read them, so there's still a lot of excitement, and you know that they're going to be good, but you know that they're going to be good, and there's not necessarily a surprise. So, of course, Ulysses sat on my bookshelf for years, and I always knew it was going to be good, and I read it, and it was good, but I always knew it was going to be good. And even though I haven't read any of Crash and Hawkeye's works, it's the exact same thing. I know I'm going to love those works. Akutagawa was not quite like that, because the reason I picked this up was because I recognized the name Rashōmon as being a movie that I haven't seen, but it came really highly recommended, and I saw this really nice cover. I figured, hey, I like short stories, I'll pick it up, I'll read the source material, and then I'll go and watch the movie, which I unfortunately still haven't done because I just finished this book and I wanted to make a video on it straight away. But yeah, it was really cool basically to just have that excitement again, and to kind of accidentally discover that this is probably my favorite Japanese author now. So yeah, I really recommend reading at least this collection, because there's so much, and I do want to go and pick up, I believe the work is called Kappa. I think it's a longer work that Akutagawa was writing in the last couple of years of his life, which is not included. It's too long to be in this collection, but yeah, let me know if there are some other Akutagawa works that I should check out. But anyway, jumping into the story. So we start with Rashōmon, which was really surprising because I hadn't heard much about the movie. I knew that there was some sort of like different storylines, and so I was really surprised to read the story Rashōmon and find out that this is not the story that the movie is based off. The movie is actually based off the book, the story that follows in this collection, In a Bamboo Grove, but the title Rashōmon was taken. I think there's some things going on, like the frame tale of people sitting around while it's raining and that they're at the Rashōmon gate, but it's really not this story, which was kind of funny. But this story is still very great. It's kind of this idea of a traveling servant who's just taking shelter from the rain, and he goes up into this landing area where he just sees a bunch of like piles of dead bodies, and there's this really kind of weird interaction where he's fighting his morals, but because he doesn't want to be a bad person, but then he sees this old woman who's like stealing hair off of dead bodies to make a wig, and that's like a really kind of maybe it's also got to do with Akutagawa's going on and studying certain parts of Christian martyrdom that becomes important in some of the later stories that I'll talk about. But there is some very like realistic depictions of dead bodies that come up very often, and I think I remember in one of the later short stories Akutagawa also sort of feeling kind of disgusted, but him needing to go and like look at these dead bodies to study them. But in any case, I'll read just a short paragraph from Rashōmon. Every time a hair gave way, a little of the man's fear disappeared, to be replaced by an increasingly violent loathing for the old woman. No, this could be misleading. He felt not so much a loathing for the old woman as a revulsion for all things evil, an emotion that grew in strength with every passing minute. If now someone were to present this lowly fellow again with the choice he had been mulling beneath the gate, whether to starve to death or turn to thievery, he would probably have chosen starvation without the least regret. So powerfully had the man's hatred for evil blazed up, like the pine torch the old woman had stood between the floorboards. Later on, he's talking. He has a conversation with this old woman, and it becomes. He says, or it says. He was no longer torn between starving to death or becoming a thief. In his current state of mind, the very thought of starving to death was so nearly banished from his consciousness that it became all but unthinkable for him. Cool. And so that was just all I wanted to read about Rashōmon. I do want to talk about In a Bamboo Grove, because this is the story of basically a murder that goes on, and it's a testimony or account of several different people's perspectives on the story. So I think there's about 7 or 8. The story is surprisingly short, considering they made a whole movie about it, but I can see why this is perfect adaptability. It's perfect adaptable material. And so, yeah, there's basically the story of a dead body that is found in a bamboo grove, and they're trying to figure out exactly who caused the murder, we get testimonies from the man from a bandit who said that he killed him, but then there's also testaments from the wife of the deceased, and they don't line up. It's not quite correct. And yeah, so the story basically experiments with these ideas of how all different perspectives on a thing can seem true and can actually sort of shape truth. And it was one of the few examples that reminds me of how similar to someone like Borges, there are early precursors to postmodernism, and there's another one there's another one later on in this story that I want to dive more deeply into, about being almost just like an outright postmodern work. But this In a Bamboo Grove is a story where Akutagawa seems to be exploring and experimenting with form in really unique ways, and I liked it a lot. There's a degree of surrealism that sometimes plays into our idea of like Japanese mythology and some of the paintings of the yokai and stuff. There's a story called The Nose, which is about a man named Zenchi Naigu, who has a nose that is so long it hangs like 6 feet off after his head, but of course it's a funny, surreal image, but it plays into how it plays into like this performance and how he presents himself and how important his ego is and that he was always very insecure about his nose, but people would never laugh about it. He was always just afraid of it, and then he does this experiment to get rid of his nose, and then now that his nose is normal, because he did something about it, people around him start laughing, and it's really cool. Some of these stories are kind of, I thought that these stories would be more parable-esque than they actually are. This one is pretty parable-like, but as we go on into some of the later stories, especially into some of the modern tragicomedy stories, they drift a little bit more from just having a sort of clear parable message. But yeah, just to kind of read a short section. On the surface, of course, he pretended it did not bother him, and not because he felt it wrong for a priest to worry over his nose when he should be thirsting exclusively for the Pure Land to come. What he hated most of all was for other people to become aware of his concern over his nose, and what he feared most of all was that the word nose would come up in conversation. And yeah. I don't want to spoil how he makes changes to his nose, but it's a great story. Okay, so there's a story called A Dragon, the Old Potter's Tale, and essentially it's a story about a man who attempts to play a prank on his fellow priests. It's a Buddhist monk, so he attempts to play a prank on his fellow priests by saying that, out of this pond a dragon is going to rise on this day. And it's sort of this idea of how the rumor spreads so much that he starts to convince himself that, maybe he was actually right. And there's two things that I want to read from this story. The first is that we get a very fun description. There's another man named Amon, another priest, and Akutagawa says, for eyebrows, this Amon had 2 curmudgeonly caterpillars, and I just wanted to put that there. But what was really important, and what I wanted to read, was that in the story, when there's a crowd of people standing around the pond waiting for the dragon to ascend, Akutagawa writes, somehow or other, Eiin, the man who wrote the thing in the first place and started the rumor, Eiin too began to feel that the dragon would actually ascend, though at first it was more a feeling that he could not be certain it would not. And yeah, I thought that was really interesting because in some of Akutagawa's autobiographical stories, he talks about believing in the devil but not believing in God. And so there's this, I thought that was a weird correlation that showed up in one of his stories in a seemingly innocuous place, but yeah. There's a story called The Spider Thread, which is outright parable, and I didn't know that. I kind of actually knew the story of the spider thread, but I didn't know that Akutagawa had written it. It's essentially it's basically this story about a man who is in hell, and the Buddha is just like chilling out in heaven, and he sees the man in hell, and he's like, but one time this man saved a spider, and so I'm going to send a spider's thread down, and then the man starts climbing it, but then he looks down, he sees that other people are climbing the spider's thread, and he's like, no, you can't climb it, this is my spider thread. And then, of course, in classic mythological justice, the spider thread snaps as soon as he tries to take ownership of it, and then he falls back down to earth. A really cool parable, and I was surprised that Akutagawa wrote it. I thought that this was a story that was much, much older, and I think this is probably an example of some of the stylistic tendencies that show up that maybe make Akutagawa's work a bit hard to translate, but here's a nice thing of talking about being in hell. All was silent as the grave, and when a faint sound did break the stillness, it was the feeble sigh of a sinner. Okay, so in the second section, there's a section called Under the Sword, and this is an exploration that maybe ties into some of Akutagawa's readings of the Bible and getting interested in like Christian martyrdom. Like I said, there's a story called Dr. Ogata Ryōsai Memorandum, which is kind of this really harsh back and forth between this doctor who gets approached by a woman who is part of the like Portuguese Jesuits that came to Japan to like convert people to Christianity, and she's basically going to this doctor and asking him just to like check the temperature of this woman's daughter, but the doctor is saying like, no, you're part of Christianity and Christendom. I can't do this. You need to renounce your faith, basically. And it's this kind of really, really harsh, very guttural, like in the same way that Akutagawa explores some like examinations of dead bodies, like he does in Rashōmon. Some of the interactions between this doctor who practices Chinese medicine and this woman who follows the Jesuits, it's got some really harsh, like kind of hard to read sections, like getting her to like physically renounce her faith. Okay, so there's a story called Green Onions that is quite cool because early on in the collections you start to see that Akutagawa is exploring. And he is very much, often the narrator is the writer is a known character, and you know that they are writing this story, they're telling you this thing. But in Green Onions, it basically starts off with, I plan to write this story in a single sitting tonight in time for the deadline I'm facing tomorrow. No, I don't plan to write it, I absolutely have to write it. So then, what am I going to write about? All I can do is ask you to read what follows. And so then he goes into this story and he talks about a young woman, a young waitress named Okimi, who is kind of starting to who is trying, she, lives in almost an aesthete's lifestyle, is some relations and correlations with Akutagawa himself, but it reminded me a lot. This is the story that was, let me find the date it was written, 1919, so he goes on, the story develops, and then Okimi ends up sort of going on a date, but she has this really, really amazing moment of realization where she's living this very kind of romantic, idealized night, going out with this guy, and then she walks past the store where she sees some green onions that are for sale for like an immensely cheap price, and she is just brought back to reality, thinking about all of the deals, and needing to think about rent and food, etc. And it was a really great story to read, especially because it also just ends with Akutagawa saying, "I did it. I finished the story. The sun should be coming up any minute now. I hear the chill sounding crow of the rooster outside, but why do I feel depressed even though I've managed to finish writing this?" And he goes on to say that, "Good night, Okimi, the woman of the story. Step out again as you did last night, gaily, bravely, to be vanquished by the critics." And so, like I was saying, there are some early precursors to postmodernism that you also get from people like Borges with stories like Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote. And actually, just to read an example that talks about this turn of Okimi kind of going from this romantic idea to reality, Akutagawa writes, "In Okimi's happy heart, which until that moment had been intoxicated with love and art, the sight of this bargain instantaneously, literally in that very instant, awoke latent real life from its torpid slumber." And in the final section, there are some stories, like I said, that are basically autobiographical. The one that I want to highlight, though, is The Life of a Stupid Man, which, let me just read the introduction or the preface to this story. "To my friend Kume Masayo, I leave it to you to decide when and where to publish this manuscript, or whether to publish it at all. You know most of the people who appear here, but if you do publish this, I don't want you adding an index identifying them. I am living now in the unhappiest happiness imaginable, yet strangely I have no regrets. I just feel sorry for anyone unfortunate enough to have had a bad husband, a bad son, a bad father like me. So goodbye then, I have not tried, consciously at least, to vindicate myself here." And this is signed Akutagawa Ryūnosuke on the 20th of June, 1927, which let me just go back and confirm. Okay, so 20th of June, he commits suicide a little more than a month after this is written. And this is published posthumously. And Life of a Superman is another really forward-thinking exploration of form. It's basically an autobiography of a person's life, but just encapsulated by about 40 to 50 moments of extreme poetic beauty. And to just I'm just going to find one and read an example at random. 4. Tokyo. A thick layer of cloud hung above the Sumida River. From the window of the little steamer, he watched the Mukojima bank drawing closer. To his eyes, the blossoming cherry trees there looked as dreary as rags in a row. But almost before he knew it, in those cherry trees that had lined the bank of Mukojima since the Edo period, he was beginning to discover himself. And then number 14, marriage. The day after he married her, he delivered a scolding to his wife. "No sooner do you arrive here than you start wasting our money." But the scolding was less from him than from his aunt, who had ordered him to deliver it. His wife apologized to him, of course, and to the aunt as well, with the potted jonquils she had bought for him in the room. 27. Spartan discipline. He was walking down a back street with a friend when a hooded rickshaw came charging in their direction. He was surprised to recognize the passenger as the woman he had been with the night before, not his wife, obviously, an affair. Her face seemed to be bathed in moonglow even now, in the daylight. With his friend present, they could not exchange even ordinary greetings. "Pretty woman," his friend said. "Eyes on the spring hills at the end of the street," he answered without the slightest hesitation. "Yes, very." So this goes on, and I thought that this was such a revolutionary, outside of the box way of writing an autobiography. And the very last one, and so that contrasts quite differently to the next story, Spinning Gears, also published posthumously, which is pretty much like, instead of taking my whole life and just finding these moments, let me just give a really, really detailed explanation of like 3 days of my life and what it's like being me, and dealing with sort of like the anxieties and the insomnia that's really affecting my mental health. And coming back to what I was saying before about the story with the priest who was saying that he can't believe that he can't yet convince himself that the dragon would rise, but he can't convince himself that the dragon wouldn't not rise. This is from an autobiographical section where Akutagawa is talking to a man who, like an old man that lived on the street, who was a kind of, he had a camaraderie relationship with him, and in this section he's just talking to him. He also lends him some works by Dostoevsky, and the man is religious, he's Catholic, and so the man says, "Drugs are not going to help you, you know. Wouldn't you like to become a believer? If only I could. It's not hard. All you have to do is believe in God, believe in Christ as the Son of God, and believe in the miracles that Christ performed. I can believe in the devil. Then why not God? If you believe in the shadow, you have to believe in the light as well, don't you think? There's such a thing as darkness without light, you know. Darkness without light? I could only fall silent. Like me, he too was walking through darkness, but he believed that if there is darkness, there must be light. His logic and mine differed on this one point alone, yet surely for me it would always be an unbridgeable gulf." He has pretty much just described what will go on to be the way in which he kills himself, and he talks about going into his room, and his wife comes in and just says, "I just had this feeling that you were going to die," and he ends with, "This was the most terrifying experience of my life," but then there's an M dash, and he says, "I don't have the strength to keep writing this, to go on living with this feeling is painful beyond description. Isn't there someone kind enough to strangle me in my sleep?" Which, ugh, you know, holy moly. But out of fear of bringing the mood down too hard, I don't think there's much more to say. I do hope that from the extracts I read, I sort of conveyed how much I really enjoyed reading Akutagawa's work, and I just hope that more people get amongst it, because I don't see a whole lot of videos on Akutagawa on YouTube. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.